Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, December 6, 2018. My name is Michael Brooks on a Michael Thursday, and this is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, Daniel Bessner, professor of international studies at the Scoop Jackson School at the University of Washington. In the light of the launch of the Progressive International in Vermont last week with Bernie Sanders, Yanis Varoufakis, and others, what does a global foreign policy look like? We're going to do a continental tour for a left foreign policy vision from the Caribbean to Europe to Africa to the Middle East with the great Daniel Bessner. Donald Trump not concerned about the deficit because he doesn't think he'll be around for it. I guess that could probably apply to
show me the lie.
A whole lot of things that he's not concerned about.
Extremely boomer mindset.
I'm extremely boomer. Saudi-funded lobbyists paid for 500 rooms at Trump's hotel after the 2016 election. What a surprise there.
It's a great hotel.
It is a great hotel, and I'm sure that, I guess if people from Saudi were staying in it, that's the one country I could see the actual excuse that they genuinely liked how tacky the decorations are at the Trumps. United States bipartisan group of U.S. senators introduced a resolution saying that the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, was complicit in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Over 1,000 absentee ballots were possibly destroyed in the North Carolina House race as a major newspaper there calls for a redo. Scott Walker racing through Republican appointments to state agencies as the Wisconsin coup continues, and Republicans are coup-minded in Michigan as well, attempting to lock in austerity and regressive policies as other efforts, including in Idaho, to fight back against the expansion of Medicaid. When Republicans lose, they mount coups. It's the fascist mindset. VA officials were blocked from condemning white nationalism. And Charlottesville email shows Milo Yiannopoulos, Yabba Dabba Dooski, off of Patreon after one day. Mark Lamont Hill is another victim of a long-standing imperial attack on black internationalist intellectuals as he loses his CNN job for speaking on Palestinian rights. And the trustees at Temple University target him there as well. Lula da Silva, over 7 months as a political prisoner, pens a letter to the new incoming Mexican president as this Brazilian Supreme Court puts off a release for him indefinitely, even as over 20 other people convicted of much more serious charges in Lava Jato have been released from prison. What a surprise. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador takes aim at neoliberalism in his opening address. The Saudis are losing their way in Yemen, but new information is being revealed on the death squads and paramilitaries that they are employing there, and trillions of dollars lost at the Pentagon. All that and more on today's Majority Report. Here with mi amigos, Matt and Brendan.
Hola.
How's everybody?
Hey, ¿qué pasa?
I'm good.
Doing well.
Do you guys know any Spanish?
I can survive in a Spanish-speaking country.
That's cool.
But I would not have any meaningful personal growth.
Yeah, I could read things like on a menu, but I couldn't be able to converse.
Yeah.
I took 4 years in high school, and I basically... The problem is, unless you travel to a place where that's the language and you immerse yourself in it, it's not going to...
Right.
Language is just theoretical at that point.
Big regret of mine that I never learned Spanish. And it's a big regret of mine. I'm a bad language student. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it was the pedagogy. Maybe I could blame it on them, but I wasn't good. It's a bummer. Now, something happened that was kind of surprising. Not expect to see this. Dave Rubin is known for, what would we say, a docile interview style.
Obsequious.
Sequious. And, of course, he's extremely far right. And no matter what his latest spin on what his politics are, he just follows the herd, basically.
The classical liberal term, that game is pretty much over.
Yeah, I think the game is over. And he's a follow the herd guy, and the herd he's hanging out with are extreme far-right people. I haven't even gotten to I think it's Brigitte Gabriel interview, which supposedly was a absolute train wreck with Dave Rubin. So I was really surprised to see this, and I don't want to overpromise any fireworks here, but Tucker Carlson was on with Dave Rubin, and you're going to see a little bit of a pushback from Dave. Or is it a pushback? Is it a pushback or a really, really funny mistake that we're going to integrate into our long-standing tradition of mocking Dave Rubin for being a profoundly stupid man?
Yeah. So what is Trump then? You've interviewed the guy a bunch of times.
I know him well.
Yeah. What actually, in the scheme of what your book is about and sort of where America's at the moment, is he just the great wrecker that we sort of needed so that this ship of fools wasn't going to sink and take everybody down?
Well, he's certainly a wrecker. Look, here's what Trump is not. Trump is not the guy who comes to Washington and transforms the system, because he's not capable of that. He's not interested in that. Washington is a very specific town, okay? So, like, the legislative process is highly complex. Specific. He doesn't understand it, doesn't seek to. He's not going to be the guy who runs on these 9 policies and then affects them once elected, gets them through the Congress, gets them through the agencies. He can't. That's not his role. It's very frustrating, actually, if you're from D.C. like me, to watch it. You're like, wow, what a second, get the energy department under control. Not going to happen. There's 3 million executive branch employees versus Trump, okay? Yeah. Trump's role is...
Is that right? That's not right. There's 3 million?
3 million executive... I think there are 3 million executive branch employees. That may include the military, by the way. So it's not quite right. But I'm just saying, like...
All right, look, we're being super petty. But he did actually say it was a question mark. Like, he pushed back, like, no, it can't possibly be true. And you're right. It literally could not possibly be true that there are 3 billion employees of the United States federal government. That would be a literal impossibility, I guess, unless they started subcontracting people like in China.
Why do you think we owe China so much money?
Yeah.
We're hiring them.
Yeah, it's back paying all of our Chinese federal employees.
We're hiring Chinese people to the EPA by the 100,000.
I want to open up a new Department of Energy plant in Genoa, India.
This is why I think Tucker's like, this guy ultimately will never be able to be on my level. Cause
right.
Like, this is just too dumb.
Tucker's like, he's my new friend. And then he's just like, oh, man. All right, let's play this again, and then we'll explain why we're being so petty about it.
There's 3 million executive branch employees versus Trump, okay? Yeah. Trump's role is...
Is that right? That's not right. There's 3 billion?
3 million executive... I think they're...
It's fun being uncharitable to libertarians.
Yeah, and you shouldn't ever be charitable to libertarians. But it's like, okay, so Dave Rubin is, of course, the guy who said that Jesus would be nice to Muslims and is the what did this post office ever do for you guy. Is just a, he's just a dim-witted cynic. And I remember Republicans years ago, they tried to make a huge amount of hay because Barack Obama misspoke one time when he was campaigning, and I think he said that he had been campaigning across like all 54 states. And I don't know, maybe he was being woke and he was trying to actually inject like Guam and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and Washington, D.C. should get statehood status. Or maybe he was just exhausted from campaigning and he misspoke. And this goes back, actually, I think, to 2008. And the Republicans were always like, this is ridiculous. Like, Sarah Palin gets dinged for everything, and everybody ignores that Barack Obama doesn't even know how many states there are in the country. And it was like, well, the reason it didn't take off is because he's a smart guy, obviously, who misspoke once. Whereas Sarah Palin is saying literal, just nonsense every day because she's an idiot. And so we should be more charitable in general, including, I think, with way bigger things than misspeaking. I think we need to figure out a way to have a much more empathetic and compassionate society. And I mean that sincerely. And sometimes I even question my own role in not pointing to those qualities more. Now, that being said, Dave Rubin's a Dunsky. And somebody else might have gotten away with a misspeak, but he really is dumb enough and cynical enough to actually probably not be entirely sure that that's a wrong stat.
Look, we're just playing our role in the marketplace of ideas. We have to keep the other side honest, right? This is how this works. So,
Tucker Carlson, 3 billion? Man, I thought gay guys were supposed to be smart. It's true. You're absolutely right, though, because they got this little buddy thing going on, but there's just those moments where it's like, I mean, I really wonder, like, I don't know if he's had on like Steve Pinker, who I do not overvalue Steve Pinker's intellect. There's plenty of problems, major problems in his secular theology, which is really what his work is. But there are people who you just have to like acknowledge some just sort of like basic firing power they have. The idea of sitting down with Dave Rubin. It's like, so what was Racine's thing? It was just like, so you were interested in science.
Tuesday night, Racine happened upon Dave Rubin impression where you make him sort of like a South Park
kind of a South Park character,
and it really does work well.
So you're not opposed to you don't support racism, but you're interested in ideas. Huh? It totally works. He could be mouthing like some type of like the sock like. Or some like inanimate object and just pops in to say sort of like bigoted nonsense coated in stupidity. Folks, today's sponsor is Skillshare. And the first 500 people who go to skl.sh/majority are going to get 2 whole months of totally free access to Skillshare's entire library of super quality online courses and tutorials. Skillshare is a vibrant online learning community that offers courses on everything from design to video editing, photography, business, technology, cooking, meditation, and everything in between. I took photography. Essentially didn't have the finances when I was younger to really pursue it. It's a little bit of a, it takes a little bit of investment in order to do it. And it wasn't what was available to my family at the time, but I loved it. And I look at a site like this, that would be awesome to learn how to take a photography course. Also a video editing course. There are Skillshare courses for everyone. You'll have no problem finding courses that will be useful to you in both your personal and professional life. Whether you want to sharpen your skills with something you already love doing, or you want to learn to do something totally new, Skillshare has you covered. They have courses for entrepreneurs, courses on computer coding, web development, personal nutrition, learning new languages. We were just talking about that. Maybe I'll cop Skillshare and see if I can finally, get a little bit of Spanish. New languages, Photoshop, you name it. I've been checking, and as I said, about to check out their language and photography courses. Those are the ones that I'm going to seek out. I've looked at it a little bit, and I can tell you it looks incredibly user-friendly and easy. You can get 2 entire months of free access to every single course offered by Skillshare by going to skl.sh/majority. Just think of everything you'll have at your fingertips for a whole 2 months. Again, that's skl.sh/majority. And we've put a link underneath this video if you're watching on YouTube. We're going to take a brief break, and we're going to be right back with Daniel Bessner. Welcome back to the Majority Report. Joining us now is Daniel Bessner. He's author of Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer, and the Rise of the Defense Intellectuals. Check out our conversation on it in our Majority Report archives. He's a professor, Pyle Professor of American Foreign Policy at the Scoop Jackson School at the University of Washington, and a regular contributor on The Michael Brooks Show, part of our core crew. Daniel Bessner, how you doing? Thanks for being here.
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me.
Last week in Vermont, the Sanders Institute hosted a sort of a big progressive confab, and there was a lot of focus on Medicare for all, on environment, labor, racial justice, the core defining issues of a leftward agenda. But there was also an international component to it. Fernando Haddad, who, of course, leader for the Workers' Party, was there from Brazil. Yanis Varoufakis, the celebrity former Greek finance minister, and they announced this idea of a progressive international, which is really just the idea of having much more kind of communication and coordination between left movements and politicians and potentially governments, like we have at least one down with the inauguration of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico. First, I just want to get your kind of basic take on that move, and what the agenda looks like as far as reforming international, particularly their focus is on reforming international financial institutions, democratizing the EU, and things like that. So let me just start with your kind of broad take on that initiative.
I think it's great, and I think it's finally a breath of fresh air after the post-Cold War era of essentially a dedication to U.S. primacy. It's really heartening to see a mainstream American politician come out on behalf of actually organizing and developing ideas with people who are not based primarily in the United States or amongst the United States' traditional allies. So the questions that remain, I think, are really, what does this mean in actual practice? Should, for example, Bernie win the presidency, what would it mean? And particularly, what does it mean in terms of using the state apparatus for transnational solidarity building, or whether this is more something that would occur at a sub-state transnational level of organization? And going forward, I just think that highlights the importance of the left distinguishing between what might be considered the foreign policy of the state, using state apparatuses like the military, the State Department, et cetera, and the foreign policy of civil society, using the grassroots organizations that really transcend national boundaries, and how a political leader like Bernie could work between those. But otherwise, it's a fantastic first step towards making a better world, and the world that we'd like to actually live in.
We're going to go basically kind of region by region and continent by continent. But before we get there, speaking directly to your point, you have actually said you have a critique of left-wing foreign policy thinking that we grew up with and sort of predominated since the people, of course, rightfully dissenting about what I would deem to be, frankly, essentially American genocide in Vietnam and in Laos and Cambodia. Right. But you have a critique of what has defined the left foreign policy tradition of the past since Vietnam. What's that critique, and what's the alternative you're proposing?
Sure. So I think the critique is essentially not actually on the substance of a lot of the criticisms of American imperialism and the awful American actions in Vietnam and of course, elsewhere throughout the world, as you just discussed a couple of days ago with what George H.W. Bush did as head of the CIA and in Nicaragua with regards to Contras and pardoning everyone. So there's a lot of horror to go around, and I think that the critiques of that were very good. My problem is only that the generation of leftists that were politicized during and after the Vietnam War oftentimes have had more of a critiquing function than an actual any actual pretensions to governance. So looking back, of course, hindsight's 20/20, but looking back, I think it would have been useful for what might call the Chomsky generation to have developed counter institutions of American foreign policy that would have developed plans and ideas and really almost ideologies for what the United States could do to actually make the world less organized around American hegemony and to make the world a more just place. I think for a variety of reasons, particularly Watergate, and the Watergate scandals led many leftists, understandably, again, to be very skeptical of using state power for any positive ends, and particularly the horrors of the Soviet Union as it continued to wind down also made people skeptical of state power. And therefore, many leftists just disassociated themselves from governance. But I think what we see now in 2018 is that this actually isn't the most effective way to enact the policies and create the world that you want to see. So what we need to do is develop mechanisms in which people who are ensconced in institutions, what might be left-wing institutions, are actually connected to the grassroots as well. So we're able to have this recirculation process where elites are able to channel grassroots ideas and desires into policy programs that are able to be implemented at the state level.
And I think it's really interesting because you're actually creating, I think in my mind, this kind of a hybrid, because you're critiquing the sort of exiting of the potential of harnessing those institutions for a radically different way of doing global policy, and one that, you know, centers civil society, one that's built around sharing, you know, solving collective problems of the environmental crisis, global inequality, you know, rampant corporate abuse and power, the tradition, and well as breaking up U.S. hegemony and foreign policy, the traditional concerns of anybody with a conscience on the left. And so you're saying, like, we could use and take over these state institutions to harness and empower civil society in those networks. And what's interesting to me is that, you know, those networks were built in things like solidarity with Latin America in the 80s against Reagan's support of death squads and dictatorships. It was built in, you know, the way the ANC had a global strategy to harness civil society, particularly in Europe and the United States, to apply sanctions to the South African regime. So there's some of what you're talking about and building on already exists, but you're saying, what if the positionality wasn't just always on the outside?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I do also want to emphasize that this is just the short-term goal. The medium-term goal would be to really reform these institutions fundamentally, right, to make them substantially more democratic, like the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the military are all really fundamental institutions. And it's more about recognizing, you know, in the classic Marxian sense, what moment in history you're actually living in, and your history and you're actually living into your advantage. And this is not, I'm not saying that these are great institutions by any means. In an ideal world, I think they would probably mostly be taken down at maximally, and at the very least, I mean, significantly reformed so that they would be unrecognizable. But it's just the question of what do we do, you know, today? The way that I phrase it is, how do we stop a drone strike tomorrow? That's a different question and requires a different answer than how do we totally reform the national security state. And I think both are worthy goals, and just we as lefties need to really have different time horizons and change our strategies accordingly to those different horizons.
100%. So let's start going region by region. Let's focus first here with U.S. policy towards its neighbors, primarily the Caribbean and Latin America. But we could also tack on the trade issue by including, you know, Canada and these supposed renegotiations of NAFTA that we saw. So I'll break it into two parts. One part is, you know, today there's obviously a resurgent far right taking power across most of Latin America, with the obvious major exception of Mexico and a couple of people hanging on in Bolivia and Uruguay. But Argentina, Chile, and now, of course, with Bolsonaro coming in Brazil, there's this extreme far-right axis. And then, obviously, Venezuela is not in that far-right axis either, although I wouldn't at this point exactly call it. I mean, we need to defend Venezuela from U.S. intervention, but I would not exactly call it really a member of the left in some ways right now. But that might be another conversation. And John Bolton is embracing these governments. There is a very serious danger of, as an example, U.S. military intervention or coup in Venezuela. And there's also, you know, the sort of reorientation back towards another kind of mass unmitigated, you know, U.S. corporate plunder of its neighbors. So actually, let's get to NAFTA second. What's the step right now from this, you know, left foreign policy perspective of reorienting the Caribbean and Latin America?
Sure. Well, I think as probably many of the listeners will know, I think a lot of the problems in the U.S. and Latin American relationship just stem from the fact of colonialism, 500-year-old colonialism in which nations of the North Atlantic and what's commonly considered the West just rapaciously essentially demolished these societies through a variety of measures and means. So first of all, it's not just important to recognize that history as a moral issue, which is important in some sense, but also to recognize it as sort of the deep historical structures that we're dealing with. So this is a region of the world that the United States has increasingly and forever really perverted in a variety of ways. So the question that I see is how does one develop a non-hierarchical relationship where the Caribbean and Latin America is not just essentially used for U.S. purposes, both economic purposes and sort of the extraction of resources, and also political purposes, as it was during the Cold War and the War on Terror, when the United States variously supported right-wing regimes and demonized the left. So the question is, what does a left-wing in power left-wing movement in power do with that reality? So I think the fundamental thing that you have to do is reorganize the hierarchical material economic relationships that exist between the regions, develop some means of not rapaciously extracting resources. And this would, I think, have a lot of problems. Like many of our foreign policy problems, also has a lot to do with changing domestic culture at home. So I think if we have a consumer capitalism centered on the individualist consumer, it's going to be very difficult to rearrange these hierarchical relationships. So what we have to do is really reconceive about how Americans view the very act of consumption from which they have for which they have taken so much from Latin America. So that would really be a first step. I think a second step would be doing things like building solidarities, or at least being vocally against something like the imprisonment of Lula, which I know you've talked a lot about, and that to be very vocal that the United States is not going to allow the imprisonment or not going to allow. I see this is difficult because then you get into these imperial relationships, but at least allow is not the right term, but that the United States will come out publicly and strongly against actions like that. And that really, I think what's important here is that, like you said, you don't want the American state to really do things, but you do want leftist movements within the United States to build transnational solidarity. So I think in this instance, you'd really want to obviously renegotiate trade deals and things along those lines to make them less awful for Latin America, but also to focus at the sub-state level about working with leftists on the ground in places like Brazil who really know the territory and terrain, and helping them with the privileged position that Americans find themselves in, and that American leftists find themselves in just by virtue of living in the metropole of the empire. And so using the resources we have on a grassroots level in Latin America, and really at a sub-state level, because you don't want, in my opinion, at least the American state to get deeply involved in the region, because in the future, when there's a right-wing president, that will allow for a lot of very awful things to happen. So you also need to be aware of the limits of the state to do what it wants in this particular area of the world.
What about the NAFTA question specifically?
Well, I basically... because this also relates to the whole Angela Nagel controversy about open borders, right? And I think it's a really difficult question, because you don't want to limit the American leftist imagination due to some basically capitulating to the borders created by capital. So how do you adopt a dual-pronged program where you, on one hand, help American workers and then don't turn your back, which I think we absolutely shouldn't do on the migrants who are often migrating here, because the United States has totally destabilized their region of the world for literally centuries and continues to do so. So I think that's the sort of policy that you want to focus on, a have your cake and eat it too policy, because I think in the world in which we live in, there are, in fact, enough resources to politically distribute to both American workers and the refugees who are coming here for just and important reasons. And I'm personally more of an open borders person, and we should be allowed to come to the United States to come. So I think you'd want to renegotiate
Daniel,
NAFTA.
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second. Can you restate that? Because I think that's really interesting. You are sort of a proponent, as I would be, in sort of like almost like a social EU model in Latin America, the Caribbean, Canada, and the United States, which would mean along with all of these other dynamics we're addressing with labor, the environment, and breaking down the hierarchy, a much more sort of open, borders-oriented, kind of transnational stance, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the way that's my biggest long-term foreign policy goals is creating like a true EU but democratic organization, at least in North America, if not including Central and South America. And the question for us is how do we do that without reimposing U.S. hierarchy on it, right? Where it's not like the dollar is the reserve currency and then everything has to be pegged to what the United States does. And I think that's a really important question that our generation of leftists could examine going forward.
Definitely. All right. So then we're going to keep going here. Europe.
Yeah. And so this is really an interesting one because this is the one that all the people who promote the liberal international order always point to. And I think it's important for leftists to understand that the end of great power war in Europe is probably the greatest accomplishment of the order that the world order that the United States set up after 1945.
Definitely.
So I think the question we have to ask is how do we as leftists, both should we again win power and just at a sub-state level help contribute to the ending of a great power war in Europe? And I think what's important to do is to recognize that first, this is probably unlikely given the culture that's developed over the last 70 years. But we also need to think about ways in which leftists, both in and out of state, could encourage the democratization of the EU, both in terms of its politics and also in terms of its economics. I think what the European Union has demonstrated, beyond the shadow of a doubt, is that an anti-democratic political structure will never receive this type of mass public support it needs to survive. So I think that's the big lesson of the EU since the early 1990s. So the question is, how do we reform that institution to make it more democratic? How do we encourage the acceptance of even more refugees in Europe as currently accepted now? And of course, the United States could be much better about that. And how do we ensure that great power war doesn't continue into the future? So what's happening now is France and Germany are trying to sort of create a Central European power bloc to balance against the United Kingdom on one side and Russia on the other. So what does the United States do, right? And particularly, what does the United States do with regards to NATO? I tend to think, and you may very well disagree, reasonable people could disagree, is that the United States probably no longer continues to have a serious military presence in Europe and should basically stop funding NATO and leave it up to the local people there to decide, while all the same trying to encourage Europe through a variety of diplomatic measures to make the EU more democratic and to accept more refugees.
Yeah, and this is actually where, as an example, like, things that I wouldn't normally be particularly excited about, but I also, again, we are in our specific historical moment. I think there should be a real radical transformation, winding down of what NATO is. But then on the other hand, that actually makes certain things, like when a guy like Macron, who I really could not have more contempt for, talks about like a common European defense policy. That's the type of actually intermediary step that's going to be necessary to unwind these sort of larger imperial alliances you're talking about. So that actually is important there, in my opinion.
Right. I agree completely. And so the way is, how do you do this sort of technical thing in the short term without losing sight of the medium and long-term goals, which is really, dismantle borders, dismantle the military, and
right.
things along those lines. And just to put a final button on it, the United States should obviously not encroach on Russia's territory, basically sovereign territory of interest. And then there's larger questions about what you do with a country like Ukraine, but that might be for another discussion.
Okay, we'll table some of the Russia. Maybe we'll have a specific Russia East European conversation soon, because I do think that does sort of create a whole other set of interesting challenges and that play into all these other dynamics. But let's go to the Middle East, and let's include in it, even though obviously they're not relegated to the Middle East, these are highly used in certainly in South Asia and also in a place like Somalia. But let's include the sort of like drone global warfare component in this sort of broader umbrella, because, as you know, Middle East policy has been reduced to, in addition to obviously supporting vicious monarchies, dictatorships, and so on, also this very kind of one-dimensional note of terrorism, which has had major global consequences in sort of organized modern U.S. foreign policy.
That's absolutely right. So step one is end the drone war today. I think it has absolutely no strategic purpose and just serves to inflict violence on people who are already oppressed. Step two is to totally invest in alternative energy at home. And I think you're never going to have a just American policy in the Middle East unless the United States actually seriously works to get off fossil fuels. And of course, it's not like a lot of this oil is necessarily flowing to the United States, but it's flowing to America's allies. And there's this vision that the United States essentially needs to extract oil from the Persian Gulf and the various regions. So that's what I think really keeps us there. So I think the first step to really changing America's policy towards Saudi Arabia is to, for example, fill New Mexico with solar panels or something, or on all the government-owned land. So that would be a first step, really reform energy policy. And once you do that, then a lot of your opportunity and of your imagination really opens up. So you could totally reform the Saudi Arabian relationship, really essentially end it, stop providing the Saudi military with, and also, of course, the Israeli government with millions of dollars in arms. I think you would stop supporting a Likud Israeli government that totally expands, that constantly abuses Gaza to really a terrible, an almost an unimaginable degree what the Israeli government does with regards to Gaza and the Gaza blockade. So use America's enormous overweening influence on Israeli politics to really change Israeli policy with regard to Gaza and also with regard to the West Bank, develop some sort of reparations policy at the very least for those Palestinians who were expelled during the Nakba and all of those really terrible crimes that the United States didn't stop, or at least in some sense implicitly supported. And then the question is what you do with Iran. I think people don't quite appreciate how actually destructive sanctions are. Yeah. They're sort of used as a soft tool, but they actually truly destroy lives and destroy the lives of ordinary people upon whom you theoretically want to build a more progressive future. So really you also need to stop sanctions in a serious way and really reformulate how the United States deals with countries that are essentially liberal or following a different way of life. And I think that involves a total, complete transformation of how the United States understands Islam and Islam's role in foreign societies and Islam's role in the world. And I think leftists are also going to have to really consider what values they want to promote and what the role of the United States is in promoting liberal values that we here take for granted, but that might not have particular valences in societies that the United States has long been imbricated in. So it raises a lot of really interesting questions about transnational solidarities that will essentially need to be worked out, in my opinion, in practice.
Yeah, I want to briefly follow up on that before we get to Asia, because I think it raises a really interesting point, particularly the themes around Islam, solidarity, rights, liberalism, illiberalism, but also just a much broader sense of sort of the different foundations upon which people want to build their politics and their societies. And at least for me, I think actually people like Amartya Sen are really helpful for this because, who's a very prominent Indian economist and philosopher. I think he's at Harvard now. And his sort of argument going back to the 90s specifically, he was actually answering autocrats in Singapore and Malaysia who were putting across this thing called Asian values, which in contrast to the sort of anti-Muslim bias of American and European elites, they were kind of drawn to some of these Asian values debates because Asian values ideas, because places like Singapore and Malaysia were certainly posted incredible gains and accomplishments in terms of market development, but also were very, very socially repressive. Like the idea of, getting caned in Singapore for spitting on the street is actually like not an urban myth. Like that actually has happened.
Right.
And so these guys said, look, we have a different way of organizing our society. We're building it on Confucian values and so on and so forth. And basically to just make it really simple, I mean, Sen's intervention was, look, the Western idea that the only place in the world that came up with an idea of a sense of individual rights, group well-being, and power accountability being just specifically from the Western Enlightenment tradition is false. And you can actually trace ideas of holding power accountable and expanding or certainly the intellectual roots that you could build democratic models on, literally exist in every single social and intellectual tradition on the planet. And what you might find, and also these Asian values guys are wrong too, because they're distorting Confucianism to justify their own autocratic tendencies. And so the answer is you got to sort of build these global sort of, these cross-border recognition where you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and being a total relativist, like, oh yeah, Saudi Arabia can have gender apartheid because that's how they do Islam and we're super open-minded. That's wrong and we oppose it. But then conversely, maybe we also recognize that somebody wants to build a rights-oriented, flourishing society that also, they might be rooted in different Islamic traditions, as an example. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No, that makes total sense. And I think you see a lot of these discussions come up and a lot of these issues come up in debates over the veil, right, which was such a hot topic about 20 years ago because from what was then the American or really the French lens at the time, it was viewed as an oppressive piece of clothing. But when you actually see how it historically operated, for example, in Cairo at various moments, in Lahore at various moments, it's actually a symbol of women asserting their space in the public sphere. Right, so it's actually a symbol of liberation when it was totally interpreted here by many people, by many liberals and those on the right, as a symbol of oppression. Right, so we also need to be very important not to impose our own frameworks onto these other spaces in which the United States empire is involved. And I think it just highlights the importance of that there is no one solution to any of those issues about cultural differences and cultural relativism, and that you really have to get on the ground and have a deep knowledge of the area. And really always the sine qua non of this is always listen to local peoples. If you're a member of an American NGO that happens to have a lot of resources, you should never, ever, or a left-wing NGO or whatever it may be, a good organization. There's a lot of problems with NGOs. We can get to that in a different case. But let's say you're a good person trying to do good things. What you really need to do is listen to people on the ground and really build networks of solidarity across borders where you're not just imposing your own view. And it's a very difficult thing to do because we're all are prisoners of our own identities. Right. But it's something that I think we need to really work toward as long as the United States has all this overwhelming power, right? I think we can't retreat from these questions because this is the pure material fact that so much capital is centered here. And the military, the world's military is really the United States' military. So we have to think about these questions, even if we prefer, to leave them aside because they're really quite difficult and oftentimes won't have a good answer.
100%. All right. Asia, which I know that's huge, but I don't know. So what do we, obviously there's the North Korea dimension, there's China, the reemergence of sort of power politics, TPP, right, India, whatever way you want to take it. But what's the progressive orientation towards Asia?
So I think this is really important because I think this will be a big division between progressives like myself and realists like Stephen Walt and John Mersheimer. Right. So realists like who otherwise leftists should build coalitions with, particularly with regards to U.S. policy in Europe and the Middle East, where there's actually a lot of agreements. But the biggest disagreement between people like me and Walt and Mersheimer is that Walt and Mersheimer think that the rise of China as a serious great power competitor necessitates the United States to maintain some sort of serious presence in East Asia and the South China Sea. So I would disagree with that because I think that assumption is based on the idea that the United States should never face any peer competitor and that that some sort of primacy and unipolarity is actually really necessary to maintain world peace. And I think this is a very mid-20th century idea, understandably emerging from World War II. But in some sense, in my opinion, the rise of another great power could actually be good for world peace and good for stability. One, because it'll actually allow the United States to exit from the region and have some sort of ideally peaceful security transition to where China essentially assumes responsibility for a lot of the security concerns of the region, and which will bring a lot of capital home and will also prevent the American perversion of an area of the world in which it hasn't been involved particularly long and about which it doesn't know very much. Now, the problem, though, is that China is certainly authoritarian, and it's not only authoritarian, but it's authoritarian capitalist. So this also creates, again, difficult questions about what do you do as you know, as a leftist who has a particular value position on the world, when you're essentially ceding an enormous part of the world to an authoritarian capitalist power. And of course, I should underline the United States has done, of course, an enormous amount of damage to the region. So I'm not saying that the U.S. would be better or has been better, but I'm just saying these are difficult ethical questions for a leftist to actually pursue, right? Do you want, for example, Chinese authoritarianism to now govern the entire Eastern Hemisphere of the world? I mean,
Right.
Ideally, no, because that limits freedom and limits liberation in really important ways that I think leftists should be concerned with. But then again, there's also the reality of that the United States shouldn't and doesn't have the political will to maintain permanent presence in a region that's so far from its shores. So I think the first step to do is get beyond this idea that a great power competitor is always necessarily negative for the United States. But then we really have to think through what we as leftists do to help combat the authoritarian impulses of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's not an easy question. Now, I think some of these things will be regionally worked out on their own, particularly the Sino-Indian conflict, which is kind of always at a low ebb. But I think with the rise of Modi, it's getting even more powerful. You know, another member of this authoritarian axis that Bernie had pointed out in a recent speech. So I think in some sense it's up to the peoples of this part of the world to work out their own history for them without the perversions of the United States. But we in the United States could also take some sort of at least sort of ethical position about what is the proper way to resist authoritarianism or to transform it in a democratic and liberatory direction.
Yeah, and
without military aid.
Without military aid, but and included in that
Right.
already, issues that I don't want to, that of course, I mean, I understand why people I think there's like three steps, right? There's the sort of recognition that human rights are a proxy and have absolutely, including, literally like a proxy for U.S. militarism and invasions,
Right.
and also, but even in a more soft variety, a proxy to formalize a Western-dominated order. Okay, that's a very valuable and correct critique, and there's a certain intelligence and corrective in, don't get your own house in order. Particularly, I mean, if you're in the United States, focus on what you're doing in Yemen or, and so on, 100%. But I think the third step is there is this, if you really have this left perspective, there is a real concept of global solidarity. And so therefore, like the Uyghur population can't be eliminated in that. The occupation of Tibet, one can have whatever view they want to have of, Tibetan society. And I would recognize, sure, there's some romanticism. I think there's also, that's another area where there's been an overcorrected critique of that society as well. All of that being as it may, it's occupied and it's being, culturally cleansed and environmentally destroyed. These are real issues of anybody who is concerned about these issues wherever they may take place.
Yeah, and I think that's right, and particularly what's going on now with the Uyghurs. From my limited layman's understanding, there seems to be a lot of they're being organized in concentration camps, and the left shouldn't shrink from criticizing that. And I don't think the left does shrink from criticizing that, to be frank. But the question is, then what do you do when you don't want the American military to do anything, essentially, and you don't want sanctions, which will destroy the lives of ordinary people? So I think you could essentially adopt, on one hand, the ethical position that living in the imperial metropole, that you do have more voice than many of the voiceless who are affected by these policies. And then on the other hand, I think, like you said, build true global solidarities, whether they be working class solidarities, whether they be cultural solidarities, or whatever it may be. Build these sorts of solidarities so that at least you could give aid and assistance to those living within these societies who want to transform it in ideally a peaceful way, mostly because I think any other non-peaceful way will be immediately crushed by the awesome power of the Chinese military.
Let's go to Africa, where now, I mean, it does continue on a China theme, because one way of understanding Africa that a guy like a brilliant analyst like Milton Alamati would say is that, there's actually basically just another version of a sort of multi-party colonial game there, primarily between the United States and China, but certainly also France, with a huge amount of sort of residual power and influence there, and colonial relationships. I mean, even a guy like Macron is quite willing to fly there and sort of lecture Africans on their sexual habits, Mr.
Right.
Sort of global woke answer to Trump. And at the same time, Africa also is experiencing its own sort of boom in some areas because it's an untapped area of the global economy. And you have governments like the African National Congress in South Africa who have these amazing, incredible, sort of iconic histories, struggling with the contradictions of liberation, national liberation, and then being enfolded into this global capitalist order. What's the play in Africa?
That's a really great way of framing the whole issue. And so I think what we need to admit from the first is that a lot of the U.S. policy toward Africa and African relations is really raises more questions and provides fewer answers. Because again, like Latin America, this is a region that's been so destroyed by hundreds of years of colonial oppression that it's really difficult to take anything from day one. So as I see it, the question is, how do you give people in Africa sovereignty over their own resources while at the same time not give sovereignty, but allow them to maintain sovereignty in a global marketplace and to seriously enact their sovereignties without, at the same time, reinforcing domestic oppressions that exist in many African countries. And I think it's really difficult because the previous answer that many leftists had given is sort of development politics. Mm-hmm. But as many historians have shown, is that development politics are actually extremely problematic. In many ways, they shore up old elites, they shore up traditional hierarchies, and they actually make societies worse with all that capital flowing in. And that's really the way that the United States and China today are really trying to affect African politics. So again, I think it's mostly at this point, I don't have a good answer for what policy should be. I think we need to rethink how Africa fits into the place of the American imagination as sort of something always down there, something from which either a place of violence or a place where things are seized from, and really start to build connections with African people on the ground in order to understand what their own goals and visions and dreams are. And without that sort of hard knowledge, it'll be difficult to actually develop an American policy. So how do you help, again, I'm using the language of make, but how do you really help foster African democracy from a grassroots perspective from the United States? Should it be the concern of the American state to do that? Should it be the concern of sub-state transnational organizations to do that? I'm more likely to say that it should be the role of sub-state organizations, but these are really open questions, and I think the first thing to do is actually listen to people in Africa on the ground.
Absolutely. And I would also just add to that, the very clear, especially specifically with the United States. I mean, the United States is an African country. It's in addition, of course, it's a European country. Of course, it's also, but it is a global country, and it is the seat of American empire. But I would say that very specifically, historically, obviously, first and foremost, it's a country of the Native Americans who were genocided and had their homes stolen, and that is the foundation of this country, of course. And then it is a European project for both great evil and also revolutionary good in some respects. It's a tradition that could be built off of. And then it's also through the other founding historical crime and sin of this country, obviously slavery. It is a African country. So that not only, should it not be relegated, there is this direct foundational relationship built obviously on mass murder, theft, exploitation, and abuse, but people came here from Africa in the worst of conditions and helped not only just the sort of literally physically build this country through slave labor, but also the entire political, intellectual, artistic infrastructure of this country is essentially African as much as it is European. And I know this will trigger a lot of people, but facts don't care about your feelings.
That's a great point. Absolutely true. African history is central to American history, as European history is central to American history. And I think there is a deep relationship between these two world regions, a deep and complicated and often rapacious on behalf of the United States relationship that really raises a lot of really difficult questions centered on development and security and what the United States could do as having, I think, at least literally a moral responsibility to help the people of the continent who have been so destroyed by Western and American colonialism over the past 120 years. And it's really difficult. And I think one thing that we could do, at least in places like the Majority Report and the Michael Brooks Show, is at least raise awareness, because I think most Americans have no sense of what's going on in Africa. So I think at least raise awareness about what the left could possibly do to help people on the ground.
You cut out a bit, but I do have a final question for you, Daniel. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay. So this is great, and obviously there's a lot of other themes. I mean, there's plenty more content we're going to do, but the final question I have, one of the things emerging out of this as a complement to the idea that Ocasio-Cortez is doing so much great work with entering into Congress of a Green No Deal in America to green the economy, create a bunch of new jobs. There's some interesting arguments about that already coming out of the gate on would the sort of level of consumption that came out of that sort of still pose long-term problems in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and so on. But being that as it may, I mean, do you think that there's now the talk of a global Green New Deal? Do you think that dealing with the ecology crisis and all of its manifestations, because let's not just climate, but also deforestation, acidification of oceans, and all of the just primary human concerns that are implicated in that, do you think that that's a solid sort of organizing principle to build this nexus around of a global leftward governance and movements?
That's a great question. I think ethically and morally, yes. And I actually think also that it will be something around which we'll be able to build solidarity, particularly generationally. And so I think there's a big difference between people who are, let's say, older than 65 and people who are younger than 65 due to a variety of historical experiences, but also because the people over 65 are not really going to be personally dealing with the after effects of climate change. Ideally, what will happen is we'll see in the next 20, 30 years as leadership cadres begin to be replaced by younger generational cohorts, greater recognition of the damage wrought by climate. Now, of course, this really remains an open question, and I think the first thing you said about consumer capitalism is actually really critical. So a good way to think about capitalism is like who's considered the heroic subject, right? At some point, it used to be the capitalist, and then on some level it used to be the laborer. But now I think it's really fair to say in the North Atlantic, and particularly in the United States, it's the consumer. So we have to really point to this as one of the problems of not only capitalism, which has a ton of problems identified by Marx, but also consumer capitalism specifically, which is placing consumption as at the center of economic exchange and economic activity. So I think that's really a really important place that we can start now, because I don't think, honestly, and somewhat tragically, we're going to get much movement on climate for at least the next 5 years. But what we could do as leftists is start really questioning the very model of consumer capitalism, and that maybe it's not the most important thing to be able to get a prime package in 2 days, but rather to have it so that people are able to work humane hours. And that maybe we shouldn't always think about just consuming more and more, but the ways in which other values need to overcome consumption as the center. Now, I'm not saying that we should sort of fetishize or heroize austerity, not at all. But I'm just saying that there might be tensions between rampant consumption and the ability to do good in the world that we need to explore and theorize more fully, or I think a lot of people have done this, but discuss more explicitly in forums like this one.
Daniel Bessner, this is great. I really appreciate your time as always. And just once again, everybody, the book is Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectuals. Really important book for understanding our world today. Daniel Bessner, thanks a million as always. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Michael. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye. All right, folks. I think we've got our marching orders.
That about covers it.
That, with like the major exception of things like, are we going to have another like arms race with Russia? It does cover it. But covered a good amount. I'm going to just do a brief editorial here. I mean, Bernie, if you start to think properly globally, which you have to, Not in the sense of like, oh, I'm someone who's informed about what's, the crisis in Indonesia, so you can sort of like look smart at a dinner party. But just the fact that whether you're talking ecologically, whether you're talking the ability to establish the type of great goals that, as an example, Jeremy Corbyn has in the UK, you are always going to be under danger. My God, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. The amount of pushback he's going to get from the United States, from Anglo capital, from traditional power hierarchies and corruption inside Mexican politics is going to be awe-inspiring if he actually attempts to do the agenda that he outlined in his inaugural speech, which was totally clear and uncompromising about the rampant theft of neoliberalism and also his solutions, which really are basically, Rooseveltian social democracy, but that's considered to be incredibly radical for people in a developing country and anywhere in our modern context. And of course would be a huge improvement for most people's lives in Mexico. So you got to think in those terms, because even if you're just primarily concerned with the United States, both there's the ethical obligation from what we project through empire and also the reality that it's going to be profoundly hard to sustain progressive domestic accomplishments in a world governed by capital. And so you need to be thinking in those terms. And Bernie Sanders is the only one. I'll always give credit. Chris Murphy's great in terms of his focus on the rampant crimes and abuses that the United States is supporting and participating in every day in Yemen. Most Democrats have renewed their support for the Iran deal, which is the great accomplishment of the Obama administration, and most have talked about, various concerns of global ecology and this and that, and that's great. But the only one with a diagnosis of the world, let alone global solidarity, is Bernie Sanders, period. And I hope that changes. But you got to be real about that. Okay, become a member of the Majority Report today, majority.fm/become a member. Pennies a day makes this show possible and us accountable to you, first and foremost. The Bell House show for the Majority Report is almost sold out. Get your tickets quickly.
Those tickets are in the double digits, folks.
Yeah, quickly.
Remaining?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah.
This might be your last day,
Yeah,
folks.
This is probably the last day to do it. I'd go do that immediately. There's a link on the majority.fm homepage. The Michael Brooks show also at a very steady clip, so that if you hold off and wait till the last couple of weeks they're open, it's looking like it will be the same situation. So I would just go get those tickets quickly as well for the February 1st Michael Brooks show. Michael Brooks show on Patreon, patreon.com/TMBS, just did an illicit history of neoliberalism with Quinn Slobodian. Mike Racine was a huge amount of fun. Next Tuesday, Matt Taibbi's back. You can also really start to really regularly watch clips. We've been really ramping up Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel, and there's the Unlocked Post Game with Richard Wolff. You could, of course, subscribe to it on iTunes. And YouTube is suppressing our free speech and has not monetized our videos yet for a variety of just...
They're for whatever reason, I think it might be the size of the Majority Report clip. We don't run into nearly as much copyright issues as we are running into with the Michael Brooks show. We got
actually kind of. I wonder if it does. I'm being facetious when I say the free speech stuff to make fun of Dave Rubin, but it is actually really weird.
I think it's just algorithmic. Like MR is bringing in money already, so they're not going to F with us. But we got dinged for playing a Trump clip from the Associated Press the other day, which by any reasonable standard would be obviously be fair use. Otherwise, what purpose is the Associated Press?
Literally, what purpose is the
serving?
AP? Exactly. And so now there is an ad on that video, because it's gotten a lot of views.
But
the money is going to the AP.
Yeah, and we don't want to change exactly how we're doing the show. So ultimately, if we have to choose between playing clips like that are going to give context, or completely, expunging that sort of stuff and having a completely media-less show, we're going to do the former, and we're probably going to run into copyright issues. So that's why things like Patreon are a nice, useful end around that sort of thing.
Exactly. So yeah, that's the situation. Matt, what's going on with Literary Hangover, and happy birthday.
Thank you very much. Yeah, tomorrow night recording on Democracy and Change. I've been getting deep into that controversy. It's be very interesting. Basically, to give you a little preview, it's sort of the question is James Buchanan libertarians Machiavelli or libertarianism's Forrest Gump?
That's a good frame. Check out The Antifada, patreon.com/TheAntifada, the Wu-Tang universe of left-wing podcasts. We will see you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy, back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you can imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy, back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Almost says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
I am a total cunt.
Can we bring back DJ Dannerky's song, please?
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Dannerky.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break for people.
That's fucking nonsense.
Hey, folks, reminder.
I do not have Parkinson's.
And the alpha males are
psych. Fuck 'em. Almost says what? Almost says what? Hell of a lot of back. 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 Hell of a lot of back.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
The alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black.
See Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on! Fuck 'em. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday! Happy birthday to me, Jew boy! I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are back. Africans are black.
Come on! Come on! Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
The great DJ Dannerky. We are back on the fun half with three amigos. I guess Jamie's not here because she's not. She was a little under the weather. All right, let's take a call out of the gate. This is you're calling from a 301 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Michael, is that you?
This is me.
Hey, it's Vito from Maryland.
Hey, Vito, what's going on? What's on your mind?
Hey, so I was wondering if any of you have had a chance to read book by, I think it's Jason Stanley. I think.
No, what's?
Well, how fascism works.
Did we have him on the show? We had him on the show, I think.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, he was on the show.
Yeah, because when I was reading that, it was just the thing that was really sort of startling to me in that was, I mean, not the basic precepts or the basic, things about fascism, but how how native it is to the United States, and he had pointed out how
so. It ain't an import.
Yeah, so
the Confederacy was proto-fascist.
Exactly. A lot of people tend to think of it as like a European thing, and it's not. It's
I got some ideas from you guys.
Yeah. In fact,
I think
very jealous about that whole Wild West thing.
To like the Jim Crow and the.
Well, we had another. I want to let you finish your thought, but just
in the early 20th century,
we had another guest on. It's a Yale professor who wrote a book called, I think it was like Hitler's Confederacy.
Hitler's American Model?
Hitler's American Model. Hitler's Confederacy would have been a better title. But Hitler's American Model was all about how the Nazis drew from and built their model off of the Jim Crow South. And also, of course, South Africa, the apartheid South African regime built off of the American South. So, yes, fascism is absolutely American. It's as American as slavery.
Yeah, and he even made a point that the Nazis at the time, when they were looking at the sort of the Jim Crow South, and how the whole one drop of blood makes you.
Yep.
They were like, wow, that's like really fascist. We're not that.
Taking a bit farther,
it's
guys.
Really like I forget what they came up with, like whatever the ratio was to consider to be a Jew or whatever. They like Jim Crow South, and I just thought that was just that's the part to me that sort of took me aback a little bit, but
you guys are going a little too far.
Really good book.
Little too far.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the fundamental critique of like Upton Sinclair Lewis's "It Can Happen Here" or "It Can't Happen Here" book, because the problem is it kind of did before.
It did happen here. You just didn't notice
Jefferson
it.
Davis didn't have the industrial capacity of Abe Lincoln. Otherwise, he would have liquidated his. Well, I don't know what they would have done, because they needed the slaves to function.
Yeah, they would have just had.
They would have killed.
They
would
have just had.
It would have been brutal.
Mass murder and techno-industrial apartheid.
Yeah.
And slavery. Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys. Talk to you later.
All right, thanks, Vito. Appreciate the call.
That's an American exceptionalism thing, right? Like we can't accept that the bad thing happens here.
And I think it's I'm on one hand, I mean, I'm actually totally I think Harvey K's mission to show that America also has these incredible social democratic traditions, and back to the founding, people like Thomas Paine were not only abolitionists and supported women's rights, they were also actually even prototyping things like universal benefits and labor unions through the guild system.
Paine was very driven by commons enclosure and resistance.
Yes, which actually has, obviously that's at very least socialistic Caro Polanyi style themes, but exactly. But so you got to be, I don't know what that is. There's no one else in the line. Yeah, but that it's there is this American tradition of radicalism and progress and everything, and of course Dr. King. I mean, there's all of these models that we need to build off of and talk about, and not let the right claim the images of American history 100%. And then conversely, there's actually, even among some people that are very critical of the United States, both domestically and internationally, still have not fully absorbed how fascist it's been here either. Right? It's yeah, we do all this bad stuff, and there was the racism, and there was the sexism, and there was the this, and even people who don't think they mean well, I think they don't. I just even feel like in the way I specifically absorbing fascism here is still pretty unusual, and that is a form of American exceptionalism, even amongst people who I think are quite astute about America generally.
Well, and the distinction is sort of what is popular and what is sort of elite, right? Like Thomas Paine is interesting because he's sort of he's why the American Revolution had a popular backing. Like you read Common Sense, and there's not a whole lot you can disagree with in what it says about monarchy and that sort of thing. That wasn't obviously what George Washington was exclusively fighting for, or any of those guys, right? Like they had a whole bunch of cynical, almost real estate motives that they wanted to, but they those obviously weren't going to win them support. So they frankly probably agreed with some of what Thomas Paine was using, but also saw what use that could be in terms of propaganda. But that's the message for the left.
He saw what use they could be for a revolution, which is also the other lesson.
But the lesson I take from it is that in order to get the people on your side, like this leftism sort of communal approach is what actually, like, and it's what happens throughout the world wars too, right? Like we have these sort of racial barriers get broken down, and like, look at these black people can fight for us in World War I. They're going to come back and expect their freedoms. Well, didn't really quite work out like that. But like the quote, like the times that try men's souls, men, like obviously, right? But like that. When it comes to the crunch and you actually need popular buy-in from the mass of people that are here, it ends up pushing things, I think, often in the right direction. That's what I think is redemptive about like what Harvey K is talking about.
Totally. I agree with that completely. You're calling from a 717 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hi, this is Danny from PA.
Hey, Danny, what's going on?
Two things. The first is about the topic about consumption patterns in the first world and what impact that could have on left foreign policy and broadly a sustainable development. And the thing I wanted to bring up about that is there's a big example in the Western Hemisphere of a country that, I think the only country in the world that has achieved sustainable development, and they have a high ranking on the Human Development Index and a very low ecological footprint. That being Cuba. Cuba, since the revolution, has pursued a path of very sustainable development. And I think that example could be, maybe not a perfect blueprint, but definitely something worth taking into account of how countries can go from, what Cuba versus, I think, what was the UN agency, if you know off the top of your head, that called
UN
Cuba
Development?
like the golden standard? Yeah. Called it like the gold standard for sustainable development because they don't consume as much fossil fuels. They just have a good development program for themselves.
I'm a big, I think in like the mass conversation, Cuba's been so demonized, and there has been obviously going back to the early. I'm going to let you go, Danny. I'm going to respond to you, but it's just a lot of static. All right, but I'm going to answer. I think that Cuba is basically, yes. I mean, look, the United States tried to assassinate Castro literally dozens of times. There's a blockade. There was a fitting into the Cold War, and there was certainly, if we're being real, the Cuban government of Castro did a lot of things that probably, if anybody's being intellectually honest, would even again, actually, let's just make it really real. If you're a modern bourgeois person in Brooklyn, you would not feel comfortable with the types of restrictions that you get in a Cuban context, and I think it's delusional to, and certainly some Cubans are not happy with those restrictions either, and it'd be delusional to not acknowledge that and be real about it and have but on the other hand, it's a critical support from me, frankly. The Cuban Revolution was just and right. They have accomplished incredible things in healthcare, education, literacy, local sustainable agriculture initiatives. Castro is an incredibly complex, in some ways very brilliant figure, in other ways totally flawed, autocratic one in others, like many. But the way they're talked about here, especially in a context where people like Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore, is uncritically worshipped in the United States. His human rights abuses almost certainly exceeded Castro's or were comparable, in my opinion. I'm sure some would think they were less, but he was certainly extremely autocratic. But he built a free market autocracy. So that was acceptable here. And then not to mention the real monsters, the Zavimbas, the House of Saud, the Bibi Netanyahus, and the, just endless parade of dictators and military dictatorships that we supported across the Caribbean and Latin America who never did a goddamn thing for their people. So there's a lot to learn from Cuba, and it's an incredible accomplishment that they're still standing. And there's definitely things to learn from Cuba. I agree. A lot to learn from Cuba on development issues. You're calling from an 817 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, how's it going?
Hey.
My name's Matt. I'm calling. I'm in North Dakota, but I'm from Texas.
Oh, wow.
And no offense to Matt, but I hate North Dakota. So,
well, sir.
What are you doing there if you hate it? What are you in college?
Oil, stealing our oil, like
stealing their
Texans usually do.
I'm active duty military. So.
Ooh.
Okay.
Yeah.
You better mind your P's
Not
and
much
Q's,
choice.
Matt. Yeah,
Yes,
he's
sir.
serving our country, you bastard. Well, what's on your mind, Matt? Thanks for calling. Sorry you're in North Dakota.
So, oh yeah, no worries. So, I've been reading more and more into like economic theories about like how the state is involved in our economy.
Mhm.
And are you guys familiar with Mariana Mazzucato?
Yeah, a little bit. She's good.
Okay, yeah. I was going to see if you guys should have her as a guest one day, because I've been reading her book and The Entrepreneurial State, and it's a really good book. Her and also Linda Weiss, she wrote America, Inc., Innovation and Enterprise in the National Security State. But I've been getting more and more interested in it.
What was the name of that book?
Like
Would you
method
mention
to-
the second book one more time? Brendan, do you mind getting that down? What was the second book?
Question mark, or America Inc. question mark, Innovation and Enterprise in the National Security State. It actually, that one focuses more on, it delves more into how the national security apparatus is involved in these economic ventures, and
right.
Whereas Mazzucato is more about like changing the narrative about our how we take risks in our economy.
Yep.
And a method of tackling, a green revolution as far as state intervention, which, I mean, she's not really a socialist by any means. She's a capitalist. They're both capitalists, but I think it's interesting that they're, so focused on the changing of the narrative, yet still holding to these ideas of like profit motives and whatnot. And I'm like,
well, if you look at, her,
democracy in there.
100%. And I'm not, I mean, I'm a socialist, but I think everybody should read and take ideas from every source possible. I know Maria Mazzucato is really interesting. I think actually, to be honest, we did a couple years try to get her on the show, and it just logistically didn't quite work out, but that's somebody definitely to put back on the list. And also, I would look up on, related to this, there's just about a 3-minute clip on YouTube where Mark Blythe, who's a great, the economist at Brown, he explains what Brazil under Lula and Dilma did in the Mazzucato model, actually, in terms of using state investment to spur innovation and then put the, redistribute the rewards. Actually, maybe we could find that. It's only like a 2-minute clip. We could play it maybe. You got anything else, Matt?
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, so like I missed the libertarian callers. I wish we could get more libertarian callers in, because I love hearing y'all debate with them. I actually got a chance to talk to my local representative. His name's Jonathan Sticklin. This was like a couple years ago. I wanted to talk to him about climate change and kind of like how we could tackle it with this particular method.
Mm-hmm.
And one example I used that I thought was kind of effective, kind of got him thinking a little bit, was the whole like cars, how cars work in our society, and how the government invests in highways as opposed to public transit.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's a lot of data that goes into how public transit could definitely be a lot better in that regard. But I wanted to really get him on the libertarian front from that perspective. And I told him, like, when we invest in highways and stuff like that, I mean, we're really making a commitment to less choice in our economy as far as what type of transportation you're going to take. You're basically telling people you're going to increase the amount of state security, like more highway patrols, more seatbelt laws, more laws in general that have to regulate this type of transportation. And then also I kind of threw in there, like, there's a lot of propaganda that has to convince people you need a car, you really need a car, like luxury and you know, all this stuff. And in school we learned a lot about how advertisements are basically the perfect example of logical fallacies. So, but I don't want to get too nerdy on you.
I don't think you could have worked in the brand strategy space, buddy.
On the what?
I don't think you could have worked in brand strategy. No, I think you're totally right. I mean, there's good, not only logical fallacies. There's interesting literature on, like, I think they call it the manufacturing of desire, and when advertising shifted from just sort of like saying what a product did to selling emotional experiences. And yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, I don't want to turn it into like a lifestyle thing. That, you know, obviously to deal with big problems, there needs to be major changes in policy and institutions. But there's no doubt that, I mean, there's just patterns of consumption that we have that I'm not a hair shirt person. And I think if you've ever lived with any type of even mild, serious material even mild material deprivation, you want people to, you know, have nice things and live a comfortable life 100%. But I think Daniel Bessner's right. Like, I don't know that, you know, does everybody constantly ordering everything on Amazon? Is that compatible with a sustainable world? Is that compatible with, you know, not totally grinding workers? I don't think so. I really don't. I think there does need to be some real changes in how we consume. And I think definitely I mean, that's one of the remaining, for all of the huge problems of New York in terms of gentrification and expensiveness and all of this, not having to have a car here, it's massive. It's huge. Hugely positive benefit on everything from ecology to social life to your personal health. So no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I think one thing I get from you listening to you guys is more about the social, cultural aspects of these issues, and I really, you know, appreciate that, because if I just focused on this whole, like, well, the economics of it all, you know, then I don't think I would have a very good grasp on these concepts. So I appreciate you guys' show.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks a lot. Hopefully you get out of North Dakota soon.
Have a good one.
Did you find that Blythe clip? It's kind of interesting. If you just put in Mark Blythe Brazil, it kind of speaks to what he's talking about. It's like a 2-minute clip. Because I can't explain the Matsukudu thing as well as he does in that clip. Yeah, that's it. This is sort of what she's getting.
A little bit about the BRIC countries and especially what Brazil needs to be doing.
Brazil needs to do what Brazil's been doing, which is awesome.
So this is like when Brazil was doing awesome. This is several years ago. Yeah.
So quick primer on Brazilian political economy. For years and years and years, they had one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. They were incredibly unequal. And they had a problem because wealth being so concentrated meant that the people who make effective investment decisions decided that their own economy was too risky because it would either be run by the military or run by the communists or run out of town. So they would take their money and they would put it in Citibank, which is nice and secure, and you get a lesser rate of return, but you don't matter because you own everything anyway. So that's the way it went on for years and years, until it got to a point where basically you had to spend so much money on private kidnap insurance and mining your house against the people who would try and kill you, that they did a deal with a guy called Lula. Lula used to run the Workers' Party. So the guy running the Workers' Party, the lefty guy, comes in and basically does exactly as I said at the bottom of that slide. Democracy is asset insurance for the rich. Stop skimping on the payments. So they did a strategy whereby they got BNDES, the Brazilian National Development Bank, to bank their lending portfolio, by the way, is twice the size of the World Bank, to subsidize domestic corporations so that they could multinational. So you got companies like Embraer, the aircraft company, there's a big cement company, others, that are now globally successful corporations. Because of that expansion, bankrolled by the development bank, what they do is they tax the companies on their earnings abroad, bring that back in, and they set up something called Bolsa Familia, which is the welfare state that Brazil never had. This has squeezed the income distribution like this at the same time as it's gone up, which enables the Brazilians to finally build a middle class. It empowers the middle class, and it disempowers the traditional land-owning elites. So what you end up with, there's a little fix you do with domestically high interest rates to keep these guys happy. But what you've actually done is to engineer a kind of neo-developmental welfare state, which has actually been great for Brazilian growth and has actually brought down a Gini coefficient. Because of this, everybody wants to buy Brazilian assets, which is why the real's going up, and they're export dependent, so they're freaking out. So what they've done is they've put inward capital controls on inward investment. And usually the big fear is, you know, you put your money in, they put up capital controls, you can't get it out, it's expropriation. They're doing it totally different. They're like, you want to come here? Dead easy. Pay a transactions tax and a deposit. Because if you're not coming in for the long term, forget about sitting here earning high interest rates just because you can. So they're making it difficult for that money to come in. But as a growth node in a big country, it is happening nonetheless. So the real's going up, the economy's slowing down. But what they've done over the past 10 years, I think, is nothing short of remarkable.
So yeah, that's, and you know, that's, I mean, and some of the stuff that they investigated and tried to leverage, there was for sure corruption in some of those enterprises, but that's the model they built, and it's very analogous to how she talks about using the state for innovation. They also had big implications for public health expansion as well in Brazil, and that was probably like in 2012 and 2013 when everybody's recognizing the immense success of this model. And unfortunately, instead of democracy being asset protection for the rich and oligarchs in Brazil decided to just go back into coup mode because they could not deal with this this sort of arrangement, because I think probably for some legitimate concerns about things like crime, but mostly because of just pure class hatred and resentment of having like Afro-Brazilians in governance, as an example. That was another major thing that the Workers' Party government put in place. Okay, let's see. Louis Gohmert was talking with Stuart Varney, and, well, this won't surprise any of you, but this happened.
Orwell's, mentioned George Orwell's Big Brother. I've been saying for a long time now, the only thing Orwell got wrong was the year. Otherwise, he was right on track. But look, Google has repeatedly sold their souls, and that's your editorial is dead on right. They want the 1.2 billion or so folks in China part of their system, and they've been willing to literally sell their soul. And you mentioned Orwell. It also reminds me of another George Soros, you know, because Google is born in a free country, and then they go over and oppress others, help oppress in another country. George Soros was supposed to be Jewish, but you wouldn't know it from the damage he's inflicted on Israel and the fact that he turned on fellow Jews and helped take the property that they own. This same kind of thing. Google coming from a free country and helping oppress. But China's been oppressing for a while. I mean, I've emailed with people over there. Well,
what can you do? I mean, you're on the Judiciary Committee. You're interviewing Sundar Pichai. I mean, what can you do?
Yeah. Well, for one thing.
Okay, so fascism is American. That is, I mean, the George Soros jokes are funny. But the reality is that this guy's work is getting shut down in Hungary, which is run by a absolutely neo-fascist government, part of this far-right, right-wing bloc, and deeply connected with Steve Bannon's attempt to internationalize these efforts of repression. We had that guy, it's already off of the news, who was sending pipe bombs to the Obamas, to the Clintons. It started with George Soros. And you have an elected member of Congress who everybody gets, if you're watching the show, that he's a joke and a moron and a jackass and an idiot and he's funny and easy to make fun of and all the rest of it. But that's a member of the United States Congress on the largest cable news channel spreading not only lies about George Soros, like things like George Soros was essentially a child, or at the very least a teenager, escaping Nazism, going back to an old chalkboard anti-Semitic conspiracy theory from the Glenn Beck days to smear this guy as a Nazi collaborator. It's actually really dangerous and disgusting.
It's in the genre of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, 100%.
It's 100%. On the heels of Facebook paying a Republican firm to do anti-Semitic strategy, because George Soros actually sometimes, and billionaires shouldn't exist as a category. No one should have that amount of assets. It's fundamentally antithetical to democracy, period. If there's one billionaire, maybe Tom Steyer, and I know I have different politics than these people, but they occasionally put their money to some actual civic-minded things, not just Democratic candidates. George Soros, good for him, has helped fund groups that are concerned about the fact that essentially Facebook is a engine of fascism and a global stalker economy. Facebook, under the obscene, immoral, grotesque, and disgusting leadership of Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, hired a Republican sleazebag agency who's one of the principals you could formerly could find on Pod Save America to do sort of, Jew baiting material for far-right sites about George Soros. And it gets recycled and washed with, again, this guy, sure, he's like Elmer Fudd, Wile E. Coyote, he's a jackass, a moron, an idiot. Well, he's a jackass, moron, and idiot who's in Congress and on Fox News.
Fox Business, too.
Fox Business.
Like, Fox Business, I mean, I know this from, relatives. They're like, oh, yeah, I don't watch Fox News, but will watch Fox Business.
Right.
Not a single bit better. Like Maria Bartiromo.
I would say it's worse.
Yeah,
honestly. That's where they farm them.
Right. And it's because it's under this veneer of this is the business news.
Right.
And people are complete marks for that thing.
Yeah, the idea of the business channel, getting news to the business channel, is an interesting sort of 21st century idea.
Do you have any you want to expand on that?
Just that it's you're too busy with your business to get all the news, so we're just giving you the most important stuff, which is going to allow you to continue to run your business.
Well, and it also makes markets seem like something everybody can be a part of.
That's right.
Look at
right.
I know what the Dow Jones is. I have a second by second update of that, and it's who gives a shit what the Dow is?
I was thinking, yeah, it's funny, when you get your phone, how that's a pre-programmed app in it.
Yeah, ridiculous.
And it's I don't have any money there.
Yeah.
This has nothing to do with
I hope it goes down.
Right, essentially.
I know there's people that are probably that's very, come on, let's not say that, but I don't care. I don't know.
Well, it just shouldn't, even if you did have a modest investment in a safe stock, right? It just isn't, you're not part of it. That app cues you to think you're part of something that you are not a part of unless you're an incredibly small fraction of people.
And that's a huge thing for our generation. Because I'm not even remotely even close to investing in the markets.
Right.
The idea that you can invest in the markets and just get money out of it is ridiculous to me.
Insane.
I don't care about it. I don't care about preserving it. I don't care about the good it does. I think we need to deal with other things. And if it gets destroyed,
and you care about the bad it does.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's the thing. It's all downside to me.
Yeah. Speaking of all downside, Dan, what do you call this guy?
Dan Bongos.
Dan Bongos was on Laura Ingraham. To be horrible.
Years ago, Laura, we didn't have the Airbus or the 747, okay? There wasn't a way to transport millions of people into a sovereign nation at any given time. Listen, with all due respect, I'm a practicing Catholic. I love my faith. My wife is an immigrant to this country. I'm not anti-immigrant. I'm anti-law breaking. You have to come here legally like my wife did. This isn't a complicated argument. And one more thing, to the liberals, do you have to be a blowtorch on everything? Do you have to blow up? And I mean, they've destroyed Halloween. Halloween now, every costume, every parent has to worry if it's cultural appropriation. You couldn't wear the Black Panther costume, apparently, if your kid wasn't black. This was an actual controversy. They blew up Thanksgiving for colonialism or whatever liberal victimhood of the day. Can we just leave baby Jesus alone?
They're not fun people.
Friends
I'm
don't
sorry,
let
they're
friends
not fun.
mess with baby Jesus. Just leave baby Jesus alone. Let us enjoy Christmas. I'm begging you. Just give us one holiday.
Dan, there's no room at the inn for baby Jesus, and there's no room in America for the thousands and thousands of people in Tijuana. Okay, it's a mirror image, as this priest said. No wonder fewer people are going to church. Stick with the gospel and leave the theatrics and the props to other people. Dan, thank you so much.
What a couple of fun people. That is the gospel, you fucking morons. That's quite literally the gospel. Look, I'm going to stipulate my one. They always find one thing that they pull. I would say, if I was ruling on it, I think part of the point of Black Panther is actually to create basically a global pop culture product with a black superhero. So as long as I don't know what they're referring to. If part of your Black Panther costume was blackface, no. If your Black Panther costume was wearing the suit, yes, that should be a globally available costume. Everything else that they said is this amazing combination of projection, whining, delirious nonsense with like a complete disregard for their own shit. Like the reason that is like a 1-to-1, like Jesus, poor family, no room at the inn, need for refuge, outside, the leader and savior of the outcasts, overturner of the money changers. Like, I don't know where you guys were in church. Maybe you were at some, like, you know, I have no clue. But, like, that is Catholicism. Like, that is Christianity. I mean, look, you could make religion whatever you want it, but it's just hilarious. And then it all, of course, all ends with Laura Ingraham actually co-signing on, like, yeah, fuck Jesus. No room for him and no room for the immigrants, which is a tell.
There is...
There's a...
the thing he says about being I'm pro-immigrant, I'm just anti-lawbreaker. Oh, really? Well, let's. How much do you want to increase, immigration inflows?
How much and why are you breaking every form of international conventions on law by criminalizing those illegally seeking refugee status?
Yeah,
get the fuck
like
out of here.
let's if you're so pro-immigrant, then let's raise the budget for border workers to help process them to get them in here faster.
Yeah, I agree. Let's do it fast. Let's make the system
fast and legal.
hyper efficient. Make it fast, legal, and easy.
So pro-immigrant. My wife is an immigrant.
Safe, legal, and fast. Yeah, I wonder how. I'm not even gonna go there with those jokes. As soon as I hear a guy like that talking about having a wife as an immigrant, I'm like,
Wonder if he uses that over her in any kind of subconscious way.
But I'm always just like, what kind of immigrant is this guy's wife?
You want to find
Where
out?
did Dan Bong Bong find his wife? Because it could be that they met at like a, New York sports club, struck up a rapport over the treadmill. That would be cool. Or
Colombia.
All right. Fair enough. That's interesting. I still don't know how they met.
It doesn't logically follow about what he's saying and
not.
using her as a shield for this.
No.
Like, you don't like immigrants. You like your wife.
Yeah, you like your wife, bud.
Yeah. Unless you get a divorce, you might not be supportive of future,
my wife
taking in more people from Central America.
All right, let's finish this Fox tour with a little bit of a respite because our friend Nomiki Konst, who is, of course, candidate for New York City public advocate, is on with Tucker Carlson. And this is actually, she's doing what I said. This is exactly what you need to do with Tucker. Yeah, Tucker, you're talking about some things that are real. So what about reclaiming money from the oligarchs and creating a Green New Deal? Check it out.
Individual choices are not going to solve the disaster that we are facing. We already have a migration issue. We already have flooding. We already have hurricanes that have hit Puerto Rico, have hit New Orleans, have hit Florida, and have displaced so many working people. This is an industry change. We have to cap emissions globally.
But hold on.
And if we don't cap emissions with big industries and policy, then those individual choices mean nothing.
Tucker can't squint harder.
First of all, hold on. First of all, individual choices always mean something.
In a libertarian's fantasy world, sure.
I'm not a libertarian, and I'm not living in a fantasy world. In real life, individual choices matter, or else what's the point of any of this, okay? So it does start with, liberals used to say it starts with one person. I guess they don't anymore because they don't want to be held to their own standards. But the solutions are always like ordinary work.
Is that a thing? It starts with one person?
I don't remember that.
I don't know. I don't remember that.
I don't know. It must have been. Tucker was at a Rainbow
Is that Adam
Gathering.
Smith?
Jerry Garcia.
Working people ought to pay higher gas taxes.
It's not the solution at all. And actually, we are against that. Progressives versus the neoliberals and neocons. Progressives understand that this needs to be a huge policy change. With the place where we are right now, if we increase the temperature 1 degree, you and I won't be living in D.C. and New York anymore.
Okay, but
we will
hold
be
on.
displaced.
No, I want to talk about the public policy.
Money.
Okay,
yes,
I want to talk about the public policy solutions that will flow from the predictions that you're making. Is there any solution you've ever heard of that doesn't increase the price of energy? I've never heard of one.
Well, okay, so if you're going to be focused on the price of energy, we're not going to have a planet in 10 years.
Hold on.
We have to talk about changing.
Wait, hold on. I thought you cared about working people.
We're going down a rabbit hole. I want to talk about the solutions. The solution would be a Green New Deal, moving to 100% renewable energy, forcing the companies that are jacking up the prices on working people to actually reduce their emissions so that working people aren't displaced, so working people don't have to pay the cost of hurricane damage and have clean water, and the water is not being privatized.
Volume is not the same as an argument, okay? So just really simple question.
You don't like opinionated women, do you?
I live with 4
Volume.
of them. You're not going to go, you're a sexist
pretty loud.
now. Okay.
He does the same Bongino thing. I live with them.
Right. I live with broads. I hear their opinions all day.
Yeah, in terms of the price of energy, I think accurately accounting for fossil fuels externalities is why energy prices are going to go up.
100%. And also, secondly, and this is a huge division. Macron just folded on his regressive attack on working people because of mass protests. No, we are not going to tackle the global environmental and energy crisis by austerity. It won't solve the problem anyways, and it will increase human suffering. What we're going to do is nationalize fossil fuel companies. What we're going to do is build incredible public transportation networks. What we're going to do is reclaim and redistribute the money that's still being generated to invest in those new projects. Like as an example, if you did a cap and trade system, but instead of privatizing it, you realize that in fact you're extracting from the commons to pollute the commons. So while that is happening, as we rapidly transition off of it, the money that is being generated from it should be taxed into a commons fund to be invested in regrowing forests, cleaning up oceans, rapidly deploying renewable energies, and building sustainable transportation networks. Those are the actual solutions that Nomiki and real people are talking about. I also have to say, I think we all know, I have a black friend doesn't work. And I'm going to say, I have a wife is even weaker. Most people, including, almost all misogynists, at least aspire to have a wife. So I don't know what point you're proving here. Get the fuck out of here. All right.
Also, women can have internalized misogynic ideas, too. This is how ideas work. Anybody can hold racist ideas, even people who are part of that racist group.
They're ideas. These are ideas. Ideas have consequences. And on a much different note, a obscure white nationalist who I've never heard of, named Mark Collett.
He's a BNP guy.
Who is a BNP, British National Party, which is a thug fascist, heirs to the brown shirts in the UK. Loathsome group. Yeah, let's do a little background.
He was in a Channel 4 documentary about Nazis in the UK, and he was one of the quotes. Let's see. Honestly, now, would you prefer? Basically said if you look at inner cities, you would say that the Nazis actually had a good idea. So that's this guy. And unlike Nomiki, he does not confuse Valium with argument. And that, of course, makes him appreciate Tucker Carlson's work.
And I've seen Tucker Carlson use the term white genocide. And when I first started using it, I remember some of the people closest to me saying, you can't use that, you can't use that. I said, it's actually true. It's what's actually happening. And I read them the UN document, and, they were forced into agreeing, but they still said, I think you're going to scare people off. I think you're going too far. But I disagree. I disagreed then, and I'm very proud that myself and others who have used that term have managed to influence the mainstream media and people like Tucker Carlson into using that term. But that's what sets people like Tucker apart from people like Nigel.
So I don't know. You have it here. All right, Matt, read the quote that he's referring to. Oh, we have the Tucker video that he's referring to. Of course, Tucker is regularly praised by websites like Stormfront for echoing and disseminating Nazi talking points. But usually he's very savvy about kind of broader plausible deniability. But here he is stepping overtly.
Looks like it's from October 1st.
Overtly into that territory.
Former Bush campaign strategist and ABC News political analyst Matthew Dowd went further than that. He published an op-ed demanding that, quote, white male Christians vacate their positions of power for other people. He's not doing that himself, but he did not notably advocate for genocide. A Georgetown professor called Christine Fair did do that. She recently tweeted this, quote, look at this chorus of entitled white men justifying a serial rapist's arrogated entitlement. All of them deserve miserable deaths while feminists laugh as they take their last gasps. Bonus, we castrate their corpses and feed them to swine. Yes.
Ew.
Georgetown has issued a statement defending Fair. Of course they have. Marjorie Clifton is the founder of Clifton.
Okay. So, I mean, look, you know, that's, I would say he's still in the realm of plausible deniability there. In some ways, this guy's he's using what Tucker's pointing to and taking it across the finish line a little bit.
Colette. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's how it works.
That's how it works.
That's how Piccolini said.
That's how the whole thing works. I mean, that's what Tucker's doing literally every night on
Secret
his channel.
message received.
Yeah, on Daily Stormer, Tucker is absolutely lapping everyone else on Fox News. He has been featured in 265 Daily Stormer articles between November 2016 and November 2018. And far behind him, Hannity with 27, Ingram with 4, Lou Jobs with 2.
Damn, Ingram's thirsty for it, too.
Yeah, what's going on?
Come on, guys. Don't be
Ingram.
so misogynist
That's
here.
embarrassing.
That's misogyny is sealing on Ingram's career. We have another Ingram clip, by the way. It's her talking about enemies of history, if we want.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Oh, no, we did this yesterday. Yeah, okay. All right, I want to talk about this briefly. Mark Lamont Hill, he's been around for a while. He's an academic. He's a commentator. He's an activist. And he, like those of us who share universal principles, is an advocate for democracy for the Palestinian people who suffer in a siege in Gaza, an occupation and apartheid in the West Bank, and are not, it is definitely a different situation inside 67 borders in Israel, but they are certainly not fully equal citizens inside what is an ethno-state. Now, the justifications as far for ethno-states, as far as they go, Israel is the best justification imaginable. The Jews are one of the most highly repressed groups in human history, and coming out of World War II, had literally just had millions of people murdered in the Holocaust by Nazi Germany. So there's an origin here, there's a history here, and there is, of course, still an incredible potency in global anti-Semitism. But the reality is that the Israeli state not only is profoundly repressive of Palestinians, it's also been increasingly aligning, because it's a far-right ethno-state, with those same far-right, traditionally anti-Semitic forces, particularly in Europe, in countries like Hungary. So Mark Lamont Hill addressed a conference at the UN, and he called for Palestinians to have full and complete democracy. And he actually called specifically for a binational state of democracy and openness for all those in Israel-Palestine. I think that this is where, frankly, this is the most idealistic position to have. This is the position that someone like Tony Judt had, who was a great social democrat and Jewish intellectual.
Read his stuff. Very good.
Very good. And it's the recognition that if you believe in an anti-essentialist cosmopolitan politics, you don't believe in an ethno-state of any kind. You don't believe in leadership, built on identity, frankly. Of course, you believe in anti-colonization and national self-determination, but fundamentally, you don't want to build a country on any exclusivist identity, whether it's in Iran, Pakistan, or Israel. And no matter how fundamentally, even one might sympathize with a group like the Jewish people who have been on the receiving end of enormous repression and abuse, we oppose that. And I would say I noticed that in the Tucker clip, where Tucker's, in my opinion, a crypto-Nazi who's drawing obscene false equivalencies but I think he's going to get a lot of mileage out of an essentialist turn in politics, which I totally oppose. And I partially oppose it, actually, because for a long time inside my own Jewish context, I've been an advocate for full democracy for Palestinians. So Mark Lamont Hill said that basically there needed to be a full dismantlement of the situation there and democracy from, quote, the river to the sea. And that triggered people because they said it echoed a Hamas talking point. He was fired from CNN. And in reality, what he was actually calling for was not terrorism, not the harming of anybody, but a global solidarity and a full democracy for everyone. And this was a piece in Washington Post by Nora Arakat, who's a Palestinian-American human rights attorney and assistant professor at George Mason University. And the piece is Mark Lamont Hill and the Legacy of Punishing Black Internationalists. She said, Hill's address and the motivations of his detractors require us to move beyond the immediate question of Palestine and issues of academic freedom of speech. His speech forms an important part of a renewed manifestation of Black Palestinian solidarity, itself a component of a longer legacy of Black internationalism and third worldism. In this sense, his speech echoed a discourse and vibrancy once emblematic of the diplomatic revolutionary efforts of the United Nations that receded in the folds of collapsed internationalism. The UN General Assembly established the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people in 1977 in the wake of systemic U.S. efforts to undermine international resolution on the question of Palestine. This U.S. intransigence formed part of its imperial global role, ranging from military interventions in Vietnam to its diplomatic protection of apartheid South Africa in the UN Security Council. And she goes on to talk about some very powerful specific cases. First of all, correctly note that Malcolm X, Angela Davis, Robert F. Williams, and Howard Cruz and other vital leaders were fundamentally internationalists and global in their outlook. By the time Malcolm X's assassination, he was touring Africa and the Middle East and connecting the struggle and liberation of African Americans to decolonization modes across the country, and again had pivoted from a sort of a religious essentialist ideology to one still oriented in Islamic spirituality, but much more in a sort of socialistic global liberation, which saw connections to Ghana and Cuba and so on. She also talked about Paul Robeson being targeted in the McCarthy era, as well as others, including James Baldwin as well. So Mark Lamont Hill is not only being targeted because speaking out on behalf of the rights of Palestinians is actually one of the only things that can actually get you fired and have you deplatformed from a college campus in an actual way. Not like, ooh, God forbid some students protested me, but like you lose your job because you express an opinion, which I'll be completely clear with you. I don't support that, even really obscene opinions. I actually, for both strategic and moral reasons, am very strongly supportive of the First Amendment in any kind of public space. And the only time it really does not apply is when you're doing any type of forthright criticism of Israel. That is clearly the case. That's how even Board of Trustees is attempting to remove him as a professor from Temple University. And to be clear here, there's no anti-Semitic comments. There's no comment about Jewish people. There's no Holocaust denial. There's no advocacy of violence against Israelis. It was an affirmative call for Palestinian rights. If you have a problem with how it echoes or might be read as similar to a Hamas comment, great. You should take that up with Mark Lamont Hill in fact, the open space of ideas and debate. Totally valid thing to talk with him about. Here is response to. But the firing of him is an obscene assault on rights and a echo of the double standard that still exists here with regards to Palestinian people. And of course, let's just button it with the obvious that just like they had nothing to say about Keonga Taylor having to have speeches canceled across the country because of death threats, people who have disingenuously built a whole brand off of free speech and open exchanges of ideas as merely a proxy for right-wing reactionary politics have no sincere commitments across the board, period. We actually do. We'll support free speech for everyone, and starting with people actually speaking, using their free speech to advocate things that we should all support, like rights, democracy, and justice for everybody. You're calling from a 267 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hi, yes. My name is Stan. I'm calling from Philadelphia.
Hey, Stan, what's going on?
I first wanted to say that I'm a big fan of yours and Sam.
Thank you.
And I never miss like a broadcast of the Michael Brooks show now because you guys have really been killing it so far.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, no problem. So what I was going to say was make a comment about your interview with Daniel Bessner. So I agree with like 95% of what you guys say. The U.S. has had a disastrous military relationship, with countries all over the world, Latin America, Africa, Middle East. I get that. However, I did take issue with the thought of the U.S. pulling back from the Southeast Asian front. Because I feel like the threat of China is really underestimated within American circles at this point. Right?
The threat of China.
Obama tried.
The threat of China to what?
Sorry.
The threat of China to what?
Oh, yes. Specifically to the people there, right? So, for instance, right, like, what does an invasion of Taiwan look like? Because the Chinese Party has dedicated themselves. They said they will absolutely invade Taiwan as soon as they get the chance, right? The Taiwanese military, right? They have this, like, their entire military defense relies on, I think it's a 17-minute defense. Don't quote me on that number. But the point is that their entire response is to hold out for an American backup if China ever makes a move on them, right? And what does it look like with China invading them and crushing their democratic society, right? I mean, we have examples of that because China has been doing this for the CCP for as long as it has existed, right? And your guest mentioned it, but like, yeah, they have concentration camps, right? I feel like just ceding that territory to Chinese, I mean, I understand that the U.S. has been terrible in terms of, like, for instance, our history in the Philippines, right? Like, that's an example of us being terrible. But I feel the yeah, exactly. I completely believe you there. I think we can rework our strategy there. There's definitely room for adjustment here. But the idea that we just cede this territory to China, I think is disastrous on just a pragmatic level. Like, so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's a really fair point. I think that we got to disaggregate a couple of things here. So I'm with Daniel in the main, in the fact that just in the larger picture of the whole world and what the United States' role is and how we actually transition to a world, if we can, that isn't dominated by any imperial hegemonic project, whether it's the United States, whether it's China. And, you know, that's a tall order. The world's always been sort of variously controlled by various hegemonic projects, right? It's going to require a huge amount of work. And part of that work is not having a military contestation in Asia, right? And I think that, and also setting aside, like, just setting aside the nature of the Chinese government, the broader point that, like, you know, let's just take it totally out of it and just say, like, the broader principle that the Asian neighborhood should be sort of more in the hands of Asian leadership, no one who isn't, you know, either bigoted or imperial would object to. So,
completely agree.
Of course, I know you do. So, okay, so there's a couple of really important premises there. Now, the third point is, I completely agree with you, and I've even made the point myself that, you know, the utter obscenity of U.S. hypocrisy, which is the fact that we go around lecturing about rights, that's changing under Trump a lot. While we are the prime violator of rights in the world just via nature of our size, but the fact that there are these other countervailing forces in the U.S. system allows there, as an example, to be like an anti-apartheid activist in the 80s could come and travel to the United States and talk about how the United States is backing apartheid. Palestinian activists can live in the United States, and are totally not given enough platforms and so on and so forth, but they can live in the United States, they can speak, they can take advantage of a relatively open civil society here to highlight the fact that the United States is a prime enabler of apartheid in the Middle East. And this apply, of course, we talk about any other number of other areas, whether it's in Latin America, Africa, Asia, or Middle East, or Eastern Europe, or wherever, that the United States is abusive and corrosive through its imperial role. Now, in China, there's absolutely no corollary. If the Chinese government is supporting a dam project in sub-Saharan Africa that's going to flood out a village, and they're using paramilitaries to clear up the village, a citizen activist in sub-Saharan Africa is not going to be able to fly into Beijing and go to the local university and give a lecture about the obscenity of the Chinese foreign policy. So, again, and some people don't like when I point this out, because for whatever ideological fixations they have, but that's just an objective reality, and it's a difference, and it means that there's more room for maneuver, at least in terms of public exposure in the United States, and that's just objective reality. So I agree with you, and I think specifically, I think Taiwan. I mean, I have sympathy for Taiwan. I think Taiwan, it's not some great progressive mecca, but no, they do have a fairly democratic society. They have, a woman president, as an example. They have a pretty strong labor union movement. They've done some good things. They've managed to actually overcome their own military dictatorship, which was a remnant of the Shanghai Shek regime. I have a lot of respect, and I know people from Taiwan. Now, what that looks like in practicality, because I don't think Daniel Bessner would say that we should just bail on Taiwan. I don't know that Taiwan is worth having a global war over. I also don't know, frankly, that China, as it is currently constituted, just as I would say, don't take all American rhetoric at face value or all Iranian rhetoric at face value, I don't know that I would take the Chinese rhetoric at face value. I think China actually has a very successful trading relationship, and there's connections with Taiwan that work in China's favor, even without, militarily reclaiming it, but they're always going to release nationalist speeches about it because that's the nature of their own sort of national narrative. So I guess the bottom line is I don't have a good answer to that. I think generally Daniel's totally right about pulling back from a conflict and actually the desirability of a multipolar world as part of a transition to a post-polar world. But I do think that, I'm under no illusions about, it's an authoritarian capitalist country, and it's it's a fair point. So it's a totally fair point.
I totally agree with you. And I just want to really put the point out there that I think we should definitely look for a leftist foreign policy, especially since we don't, at this point, no one really knows what that is because we've never given it a try once in American history. So it'll take time to develop that. And just that, simply, but uniformly across the world, we should have just recognized that different territories, different areas of conflict require a different stance, right? That we don't want to do what the other side does and have a blanket answer to very complicated questions,
right?
Which is usually military interventionism on their side,
right?
So just to think, Daniel Bessner was saying that we should listen to the people on the ground about what we should do, and in terms of Taiwan specifically, this is the one I'm just using. But I don't think, I'm going to guess, but I don't think they would consent to the U.S. completely withdrawing from their defense.
There is no doubt. I need to learn a lot more about Taiwan, but I know enough to tell you that there is no doubt that in a Taiwanese context, including people that are very much on the left, want the United States to pull their security umbrella. 100%. You're totally right about that. That is a very specific and interesting challenge. I appreciate the call, man. Thank you. Okay. Nate from Kansas City. What we're seeing in North Carolina, Wisconsin, and other places, also definitely Michigan. If you think the Republican Party is going to just respect lowercase of lowercase democratic institutions, then you might be mistaken. The ship has sailed. If you're pro-democracy, then you're taking a partisan stance. I mean, yeah, I agree. Bronze Plan. Michael, you should include a date when you plug your live show. I keep missing it. February 1st, 2019. February 1st, 2019. Bell House in Brooklyn. Also, Sam has been turning down your mic to suppress your free speech. It sounds quieter lately. I heard this actually from a couple of other people. I think that mic does need to be turned up when I'm over there. I don't know if that makes sense, but now it's like 3 people who've told me that. Okay. Lag listened today and got the date. Thanks. Okay. Majority Report thought. Roses are red. Lemons are yellow. Michael Brooks is one handsome fellow. Thank you. I like how we do these, like, Majority Report thought. It's a lot of names. Human Brian, if you want to learn a language, I recommend checking out the book Fluent Forever by Gabriel Weiner. Have you guys ever heard of this book? Also using graded readers in your target language. Side note, have you heard from Hunter Motz? Their podcast, I missed hearing his input on things. The Facebook group is toxically overrun with libertarians. Oh, that's a bummer. No, I haven't talked to him for a while. I should touch base with him. He's a really nice guy. Smart guy. I wonder what happened to that. That was. I thought they were doing really interesting stuff on that podcast.
Can't let any libertarians in.
Yeah.
Just not a single one. They'll spoil the bunch.
They're bad. One rotten apple pretty soon rots the whole thing.
Non-aggression principle. All of a sudden, you can't tax Warren Buffett.
All of a sudden, you can't tax Warren Buffett anymore. ATA minimum. AOC is incorrect when she says the Green New Deal will be an economic stimulus simply because people's electricity bills will go through the roof. California pays 40% higher than the national average. As more storage is needed, the price will exponentially increase. MIT Technology Review put CA cost for 100% renewable at 1,600 megawatt an hour from 49 at 50. Okay, look, I am not going to pretend that I know enough about this stuff. I do know that the way they've designed it in Germany and Jeremy Rifkin with his new industrial revolution stuff, which is much more being implemented in the EU and actually to some extent in China, they've created a model of basically like if you have a solar panel on your house, you're almost like a small electric company, power company yourself. And there have even been cases of people actually getting rebated money for having renewables.
Our utilities do not want that model to happen here.
Well, 100%. But my only point I'm making is that, as is literally always the case, these are not technical questions. They're political and economic questions.
Subsidize the energy we need.
Subsidize the energy we need. Reclaim and publicize these companies. And if California is doing this in a regressive way, that in no way surprises me. There's things I like about Jerry Brown. I think he's a very interesting political leader. He's not on the left. He's a centrist, highly centrist, in some ways very center-right leader. And he's doing some very good things, but he's not doing it in a way that orients addressing inequality or justice. So we already know that. So the left answer is, how do you do it in a proper way that delivers for people? And that's a political and social question. The broader technical question, there's the question of limits that Daniel raised. That's real. I don't have anybody on. That must be the Skype issue. That's the broader issue that Daniel raised, and it's a serious one. But just a question of like, she's wrong about those numbers because XYZ in California, wrong way to look at it. Look at what they're doing in Europe and always look at the political and economic reasons why.
Yeah, you can't talk about climate change and the cost of it without factoring in the externalities of what we're doing to our planet and what that means even in dollar terms if you're going to talk in these ways. And if it hurts people's bottom line, well, perhaps like the amount of energy usage we've been used to with fossil fuels, we're not going to be able to match that immediately right away.
Right.
As long as you make the wealthy squeal a lot harder than the middle class, for instance, like people, it won't be as politically bad as you think it is.
I'll tell you something. You nationalize those companies, redistribute them. You put public distribution of like a decentralized energy grids in people's hands, like they are doing to some extent in Europe, and people like Jeremy Rifkin advocate for. You have a massive increase on wealth taxes in the wealthy, and you also create public transportation system. I mean, look. New York subway has a huge amount of problems in New York, and of course, if we weren't doing this ridiculous Amazon scam, you could put billions of dollars into just upgrading the subways, which is what they should do. Period. But that being said, I mean, the cost of gas does not matter to us in the same immediate and visceral way that it does to like my mom, as an example. I'm in Massachusetts, like drives to work, has to do this or that thing. Yeah. It matters. And we would never advocate a policy that hits people like that without a much larger policy shift. So, and the first resources of that larger policy shift, as I keep saying, would be a rapid deployment of train systems and upgrading bus fleets and, bike lanes and all of the other ways in which you get people on public transit systems. I mean, public transit systems, if you're looking for an area to be wonky and nerd out on, I would say public transit systems. That is one of the most, that is an area where no matter what the solution is, no matter what we do, if you want to have any type of like decent society and survive into the future, there's going to need to be mass, and it should be free, mass public transit. Yeah. That's incredibly well done and ecologically sustainable. Sam's Tinder's profile. Hey girl, don't swipe right. That's a zero-sum game. Skull and Bones. I agree with your caller from North Dakota. Not only do you give me a baseline for intelligent cultural and sociological outlook, but you guys also provide a guideline for acceptable cuckoldry practices. Neo Progress. I also want the DOW to go down. I don't know what that is.
The Dow.
Oh, the Dow. That's embarrassing. Did you ever see how News Voice is totally infested with far-right trolls? I haven't noticed that. PK Day. Tom Hartman likes to talk about when he was young and major Detroit newspapers had labor sections in addition to business pages. We need a labor TV news network.
Yeah,
absolutely.
when you look at how print media has gone downhill since like the 70s, it's so depressing, especially as somebody who I went to school thinking like I might go into journalism.
Yeah.
That just doesn't exist anymore. Like I was watching Fletch with, is it Chevy Chase?
Yeah.
It's not Chevy Chase. It's
I thought it was. I don't know.
I don't know. I forget those 80s SNL guys or whatever they are. But anyway, very funny movie. But it revolves around a guy working on an undercover story as a reporter for like 6 months, where he doesn't have to show his editor anything. Like that is not modern media.
No.
It's hack out 5 articles in the morning,
right,
and hope one of them gets viral.
And no matter how like whatever fucking nonsense Megan McArdle tells you about that, trust your instinct and know that that's really bad.
Yes, yeah.
That's not a good thing that there's 5 blog posts instead of a 6-month investigative report.
Yep.
That's bad.
That's helping the wrong people.
At the same time, there's plenty of useful shit out there in terms of reading against the grain. Like anything in the New York Times style section is basically an indictment of the age we live in. There's a new piece out right now that I'm sure everyone on Twitter has seen, but it's about the new Bleecker Street, and it is an awful indictment of what New York City has become in terms of wealth gap and the lack of affordable housing in this city.
Are they self-aware about it, or
not at all?
Right,
but it's written in a way that it lets you, a smart reader, know that these people are insane, but that
but there's a lot of people who read those things who don't like.
They're New York Times subscribers.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating.
Well, Ross Douthat's "We Need Another WASP President."
Yeah, I mean
that is insane.
That was a little on the nose.
We've had 2 that aren't.
Black
guy and a Catholic that was assassinated.
Right. Also, yeah, but that was also the other part. Like, in addition to everything, that's what I mean. I was gonna say it's like in addition to that piece is so fucked up in ways that he clearly doesn't even know, because he's basically asserting like, well, of course, Trump's not really a WASP. He's really like an ethnic. And we
Yeah.
can tell that because he's like corrupt and sexually promiscuous.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what else you'd be implying because there's no metric by which Trump isn't. I mean, I guess unless you're saying like back to the Mayflower.
The youngest New York Times columnist of all time.
Jesus Christ.
What a storied institution.
Hell yeah. Cancel.
Yeah, cancel.
Cancel.
Have you ever seen the movie?
Support independent media.
Unless you're writing it off because you can use it as a business expense, you should not be giving the New York Times your money.
100%.
I feel like Ross Douthat, in his mind when he was writing that piece, was thinking of the movie Quiz Show. Have you ever seen that? It's about Charles Van Doren cheating in Quiz Show in the 50s. And there's a scene where they go upstate to his family's home, and they're all just sitting there in Hudson, like having this big meal, sitting in, in sailing and stuff. And I think that's what Ross Douthat's like. Yep.
So just get back to the days of cheating on TV. Angel, hell yeah, to Matt about the stock market. Who needs it? Dr. Chaos MD, Congress needs to immediately pass legislation to limit people's exposure to Louis Gohmert. He's a public health hazard. Much like lead exposure, listening to Gohmert makes people less intelligent, more aggressive, and more predisposed to violence. At least he has that effect on me every time I see that piece of human refuse on TV. Okay. All right. We're going to take a final call and then a few more IMs, and then we're out of here. You're calling from a 619 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from? 619. Are you there?
Morning. Yeah, morning, Michael. Cali.
Lauren Michael from Cali. Did you say that?
No, I was saying morning, Michael, and then this is Will from California.
Oh, okay. Hey, Will, how you doing, man? What's on your mind, bro? Hey, man.
Just all kinds of stuff like you guys, I'm sure, and everybody else in here. Before I do forget, wanted to mention, I don't know if any of you have come across, there's the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Truth. And that case is just getting taken up in Manhattan District, so something to definitely keep an eye on. The whole thing about having the perps do the investigation of themselves, but we can definitely keep tabs. And then, I don't know what kind of platform or anything. I mean, it's totally cool, the information sharing, like we do in the podcast and stuff, and shows, but it's the reliance, same thing like you're talking about with energy and stuff, is like the same way, via this tech and shit. It's like all they got to do, flip a switch, grid goes down, this, that. It's like, I don't know, it'd be cool to kind of, at least for me, I'd like to just start linking in, for people to problem solution kind of stuff. What do we do about this? Exactly what you guys talked about here and there, and just I don't know. Yeah, just like you talk about decentralized everything. It's like freaking town in right now. It polices itself, and it's like ultimately that's the best way.
I think you're. I vibe with some of what you're saying. I think you should look up the Peer-to-Peer Foundation and the Global Commons Movement. You'll find that stuff interesting. Appreciate the call, man. All right, final call of the day. Did Dan Bongo with the classic Moaf argument. Brother from Brooklyn, check out the Hassan interview with Sherrod Brown. I hope he's the next president. Given the knives that will come from Bernie, from Ohio, he can clearly combine an articulation of race and class politics better than anyone. That's cool. I still need the global dimension, and Bernie's still my number one. But also, I got to say, I'm not too thrilled about Sherrod Brown risking that Senate seat. I want him there. I do think he's
unless
a
he
pretty
might
good
lose it
senator.
anyway. But I
well, he just crushed it. I mean,
I suppose who else can win it but him? But the other thing I was thinking about is every once in a while I'll notice donut centrist Twitter throw up a gif of these are the people that are acceptable for president, right? And it's not Democrat Bernie Sanders, and Bernie will be X'd out, but Sherrod Brown goes right past them. So I don't know. He's got that for him.
think that's true, but I think I just think much like ISIS, those people cannot be appeased. And the reality is that I guess like part of it is just an irrational, bizarre fixation on Bernie Sanders, and I have to like hating Bernie Sanders is just like own goaling yourself and like, oh yeah, that old Jewish guy who wants me to have healthcare. What an asshole! Like, just bizarre. I'm not saying he isn't. I'm not saying whatever. All the usual stipulations. Everybody can be criticized, of course, but he's good. And if you're left, he's the most left. It's not really that complicated. But I think that part of it's an irrational fixation on him. But I also think that like some of it is that there really is, especially on Twitter, like there really are like pseudo woke neoliberals. I don't think that's like a huge market, but there really are people who, they don't care that Kamala Harris was a punitive sentencer. They don't care that Beto O'Rourke, took the second most money from the fossil fuel industry. They don't care.
Sensible.
Right? So I think like that saying whatever that weird, bizarre political configuration is that is actually just turned into like outright hostility to working people of all backgrounds, that same insanity will get will get targeted at Sherrod Brown if he were to emerge as a contender. Okay, final IM of the day. Oh, it's supposed to be fanfare. Whatever. Mark Maron. The more of the centrist Dems run, the easier it's going to be for Bernie to win. Like Trump, a field of 17 made it much easier to win. I think that's true. So maybe we should be encouraging Beto to run. All right, everybody. Thanks. See you tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bar, but finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive between the 101 and the 5. Do you know how far the detour takes you? Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. The months drifted into years while I shifted